We're going to start with the DM forms. There's the disclosure and modification. There's one for the buyer representation agreement, and there's one for the listing agreement. We're going to start with the one for the buyer rep agreement. These forms are going to be temporary forms. The purpose of these forms is that they are going to be there to be utilized if you have an old BRBC in place or the old buyer representation and broker compensation agreement in place or an old listing agreement come August when all of the new things officially go into place. We're going to want to transition over with these two forms. So for any existing listing agreements I think the date right now is August 12th. Where the NAR settlement is supposed to become official and all the new rules and regulations go into place ultimately when they pull cooperating broker compensation off the MLS. Any existing buyer agreements that you have in place that aren't the new ones that are supposed to come out today, and any new listing or old listing agreements that aren't the new one that comes out today or this month, we want to make sure we have our clients sign one of these forms, obviously the one that's appropriate for the party. So the first one is the disclosure and modification to the representation agreement. It's the DM-BR. This one's automatically attaching itself, I've heard, to the BRBC at this point. I don't know if it will continue to automatically attach itself to the new BRBC. My guess is that it's not, because it's obsolete at that point once we start rolling out the new BRBC forms. This just, we're going to put information at the top. It's going to be Realty One Group Fox, buyer's name, buyer representation, obviously the date in the upper left-hand corner of the first page. You need to make sure that we put in the when the start date of the BRBC was and when the expiration date of that BRBC is. Now, the commencing date, just so everybody knows, is the date we put in dates where it's valid. And if the buyer didn't sign until after that date, then it's the last signature on that BRBC. It's when it actually commences. So just a heads up on that. Section 1 is disclosure, compensation to buyer brokers. You, buyer, authorize me as your broker to represent you and be compensated under the terms of the buyer representation agreement. The National Association of Realtors has entered into a nationwide settlement agreement to resolve class action lawsuit. One of the terms of the settlement is that the MLS will no longer be used for listing brokers to make offers of compensation to brokers representing buyers. Additionally, the NAR settlement requires a buyer representation agreement to state and a definite compensation, and the buyer's broker is prohibited from receiving an amount higher than what is in the buyer representation agreement unless amended by mutual agreement. We would do that with the modification of terms form. The NAR settlement is expected to take effect sometime in August, but some local MLSs may begin implementing the prohibition sooner. Until the MLS in which the property you purchase makes a change, there may be an offer of compensation in the MLS. Once the MLS changes its rules to prohibit offers of compensation, you will be solely responsible for the compensation amount in the BRBC unless another party agrees to pay that compensation, such as by including a term in the purchase agreement, CAR Form BCA, for more information. We'll be covering that one again later today as well. Need to modify the buyer representation. Many buyer representations have provisions that allow buyer's broker to be compensated from the seller's broker, whether through the MLS or separate agreement. Additionally, there may be provisions that allow the buyer's broker to receive what the seller's broker is offering, even if more than what the buyer is obligated to pay. Buyer and broker agree is now mutually beneficial to modify the buyer representation agreement to reflect the NAR settlement. So the modification is section 2. Broker agrees to notify buyer once the MLS can no longer be used to offer compensation to buyer's broker. Buyer and broker agree that broker retains the right to be compensated by other parties, provided such compensation is disclosed to buyer and does not exceed the buyer's obligation pursuant to the buyer representation agreement. Buyer and broker agree that once the MLS prohibits offers of compensation, any buyer representation agreement allowing broker to retain any excess compensation offered by third party shall be unenforceable, and if the buyer representation agreement provides that some or any of the excess compensation shall be paid to buyer, buyer understands that since broker may not collect any compensation in excess of the amount buyer is required to pay, there will be no excess funds to be paid to buyer. All other terms of the buyer representation agreement remain in full force and effect, except as modified herein. So one of the big changes that's coming is that the old BRBC, which we covered yesterday, used to allow us, it would say, hey, if we're saying we need a minimum of X%, but we get offered Y%, which is more than X, what happens to the difference? And the old BRBC used to allow us to, the default was that it went to the brokerage. You could also allow it to go to the buyer, or you could split it in some portion. The new BRBC does not allow any excess commission. Okay, so that's where it talks about here. So there's not going to be any excess outside of what you put on that BRBC. Okay, so that's the major change here, the modification of buyer representation. They're going to sign this, so we're going to just need this signed for anybody who has a previous old BRBC come the August date or whenever the MLS implements the changes to the compensation offer. Now, keep in mind that as we move forward in August, I need everybody to hear this very clearly. There will be no more compensation offered from the listing brokerage. Okay, the new listing agreement does not allow for the listing brokerage to compensate the buyer's brokerage. All compensation is going to come directly from the seller. Okay, so we're going to negotiate that with that SPBB or as a sales concession as part of the residential purchase agreement. Okay, if there is offer of compensation that comes forward from the listing brokerage, that's going to need to get confirmed on a CBC form, our cooperation of cooperating broker, confirmation of cooperating broker compensation form. Okay, so you are going to want to confirm that on that form. That would not go on the purchase agreement or on the SPBB. So if somebody's offering you, if another agent's offering you commission out of their splits, that's going to need to get confirmed on the CBC form. So that is the DMBR. Again, this is just going to be a temporary form until we fully transition over to the new brokerage or buyer broker agreements. Okay, the second form we're going to cover as part of this is the LA, which is the disclosure and modification of the listing agreement. So again, this also will be a temporary form. This is going to be just for the listing agreements that you currently have in place that are not under contract once the MLS pulls out the cooperating broker compensation. Okay, this is our bridge from the old listing agreement to the new listing agreement. If you start using the new listing agreement right away, then that's going to limit your exposure on how many of these you have to send out for signatures. The new listing agreement here, or the new DMLA, same idea as the top of the buyer one, right? We're going to fill it out the same. Disclosure, offering compensation to brokers representing buyers through the MLS, right? You, seller, authorize me as your broker to use the MLS to offer compensation to brokers who represent buyers who purchase your property. The amount paid to the broker representing the buyer will come from the total compensation that you, seller, agreed to pay my brokerage. The National Association of Realtors has entered into a nationwide settlement agreement to resolve class action lawsuit. One of the terms of the settlement is that the MLS will no longer be used for listing brokers to make offers of compensation to brokers representing buyers. The MLS may still be used to expose your property to the maximum number of prospective buyers. The NAR settlement is expected to take effect sometime in August 2024, but some local MLSs may implement the prohibition sooner. Until the MLS in which your property is marketed for sale makes a change, the offer of compensation will remain in the MLS. Once the MLS changes its rules to prohibit the offers of compensation, it will no longer be available on the MLS. You, seller, may be asked to deal with compensation in other ways. See Form BCA for more information. Again, we're going to cover that here, probably the next form. Need to modify the listing agreement. Is B, seller and broker agree that it is mutually beneficial to modify the listing agreement to allow your property to be exposed to as many buyers as possible once the MLS changes to reflect the NAR settlement. 2 is the modification, just like on the buyer one, the section 2 is the modification of the listing agreement. Buyer agrees to notify seller once the MLS will no longer be able to be used to offer compensation to the buyer's broker. Broker also agrees to discuss the various ways a buyer's broker may be compensated. Broker agrees to use reasonable efforts consistent with the NAR settlement to continue to market the seller's property. Seller agrees that the listing agreement term authorizing broker to cooperate with and compensate brokers through the MLS will no longer be in effect as of the date the MLS prohibits such offers of compensation. Seller and broker agree that the total compensation shall be reduced by the amount authorized to be offered in the MLS. Okay, so if we were offering X commission, or the seller was going to pay us X commission on the old listing agreement, of which Y was going to us and Z was going to the buyer's brokerage, the cooperating broker, this is saying the default is that X is going to be reduced by Z. Okay, so just the amount of Y becomes the remaining commission. Okay, just the amount they were originally going to pay us, not the cooperating amount. So that's the default. If we don't want that reduced, then we would check this box here for shall not. All the terms of listing agreement remain in full force and effect, except as modified herein, and then we sign and date. Okay, so that's the DMLA. Again, this is going to be a temporary form. We can start rolling it out now for all of your listing agreements that are in effect. You can start having those conversations with your sellers to let them know what's coming down the road. Again, if it's already in contract, you're fairly confident it's going to close, we don't need this form because it's already agreed to the commission. That being said, if it looks like the MLS is going to, if you haven't closed the transaction before the MLS removes that commission, or really what I would do is today, if we have any properties in contract, I would actually fill out that CBC form, the cooperating broker compensation form, get it on over to that listing agent just to confirm the amount that was listed in the MLS is going to be paid to you. Okay, I would do that today. I would also start including this. I'd start reaching out to all of my sellers to have that conversation with them, to make sure that they know and understand what's coming and that we are prepared to tackle the future of what real estate is changing and looking like. Okay, so there's your DM forms. There's the DM LA, and then your other DM form, the BR DM form, which is for the buyer representation agreement. I'll be back here in just a moment on a new live with the next form.